You are probably aware of the concept of Generation Y or Millennials. How many of you have heard of it? Raise your hand. Almost everyone. And keep your hands up. And now keep it up if you are a millennial yourself. Thanks. Depending on the source, Generation Y or Millennials are the young adults of today born in the 1980s and 90s. When I said Generation Y, I bet many of you instantly formed the picture of a typical millennial in your head. What does this person look like? The descriptions I see most often are that millennials value work-life balance and meaningful work. Millennials are open-minded and confident, or if you ask someone else, entitled narcissists. Either way, according to countless books and consultants, millennials are, or were, supposed to change the game completely as they enter workforce. Because the birth of first millennials is usually dated to the beginning of the 1980s, they are now nearing 40. Where's the groundbreaking change? Here's the real untold story of the millennials. The cohort millennials, or Generation Y, doesn't exist. In this speech, I'm going to take you through two main arguments to support my case: widely contradictory empirical evidence and shaky theoretical ground. But because inspirational speeches have quotes, let's start with one. And it's a bit long, I know, but please bear with me, there's a point to it. In recent years, many observers have called attention to an apparent malaise among North American workers. Briefly stated, members of the labor force are thought to be less willing than previously to accept the Protestant ethic and the necessity of work. In particular, attention has focused on younger workers who are thought to hold work value systems significantly different from their elders. Typical millennials, right? Except this was written by scholars Taylor and Thompson in 1976. Similar descriptions of the kids these days are still abundant 40 years later. That's what caught my attention in the first place. I kept encountering this use of my generation in the media, often contradicting each other, definitely contradicting the millennial reality I was living in, but still they seemed to be widely accepted. Clearly, something wasn't right here. So I started studying the subject. For my thesis, I read over 30 articles and books about millennials and found 117 so-called typical characteristics. Out of these 117, some archetypes rise. There's the good millennial, the tolerant, cooperative, smart, confident, and diligent stereotype. On the other hand, there's the bad millennial, who has no work ethic nor loyalty, the narcissistic, thinks he's owed everything right here, right now stereotype. Then there's more of a neutral millennial, who values work-life balance and continuous development, is international and digitally native. So, when someone speaks of Generation Y, he has already 3 options of what she might be talking about. And these are only 3 examples of a wide range of stereotypes, all of which are supposed to be the picture of a generation. In these archetypes, we can already see a problem rising. How can we talk of one Generation Y with this many often contradictory stereotypes? Further, even if use of typical millennials were as many as commentators, I still felt they excluded a large part of the generation. For instance, I have peers who live in the countryside, who lead a traditional, down-to-earth life. Some of them started a family in their 20s. How do they fit in this picture? Another example is the concern of high youth unemployment and temporary work. When the Finnish broadcaster Yle interviews Sanna, 28 years old, she doesn't sound very confident, nor is she lacking work ethic, nor is her main concern not having enough bean bags or ping pong tables at the office. To her, a steady job instead of bits and pieces from 5 different employers might be just enough for a change. Still, you could call all these people millennials. So what's the common denominator? How are they all alike? Or a second question. What makes these millennials so different from people who made similar life choices 20 years earlier? What else than age makes them 2 different generations? For researchers doing meta-analysis, that is, study of studies, putting together former academic work, this problem has proven impossible to solve. They simply haven't found solid empirical evidence to any of the so-called typical characteristics. I repeat, no solid evidence. Moreover, according to these same studies, it's hard to justify the idea of generational differences when the differences within one generation are larger and stronger than between generations. Now we know that the evidence is lacking. It's hard to form a consensus of how millennials are supposed to be, and whatever version we choose, we can't prove it scientifically. So why is the evidence so contradictory? Why can't we find systematic, statistically significant generational differences? To understand this, and to understand why the mainstream has got the whole idea of generation so wrong, we have to look into the underlying theory, the hypotheses and assumptions of the studies. And that theoretical framework, the idea of a new generation starting every 20 years, is as loose as a wizard's sleeve. Anyone know this guy? He's definitely not a millennial, you can tell from the pipe. I'll get to him in a minute. The way I've spoken about generations in this speech, and the way, for example, Generation Y is generally understood, is a cohort, a group that includes everyone born in certain years. In a nutshell, the theory is that every period in time has its own unique combination of technology, economy, politics, key events, and so on. These combined form the spirit of the times, or zeitgeist. And, according to this theory, growing up in a specific time leaves a strong mark in you. To rephrase, being born in the 80s predisposes you to certain environment and key events when you're young, which are also the most important formative years of your life. Because the typical environment of the 90s was different from that of the 70s, those born in a certain decade have something fundamental in common that separates them from those born before and after them for the rest of their lives. And that something should translate to defining traits and values. I guess the fastest in the audience already see where I'm going. The man on the screen has to be the researcher who first found these cohorts and their defining traits, right? Well, he isn't. Neither was there any other pipe-smoking sociologist nor lab-coded scientist who did it. The reason empirical research finds it so hard to prove generations is that generations weren't based on empirical research in the first place. The origin of the idea of generational cohorts can be traced back to 2 trails. First were the real-life mad men in advertising who just found it convenient to segment consumers into different age groups. Second is thought experiment, a work of non-scientific authors who have used the idea of surpassing generations as a tool to understanding historical change. Combine these 2, advertising and non-scientific authors, and you get the millennials and baby boomers we know today. Reversely, nobody made a huge population study of values and found that there's a clear barrier between those born in the 70s and those born in the 80s, nor that the group born between 1980 and 2000 was especially coherent. Somebody just made this up, and it seemed logical enough. But these made-up cohorts aren't questioned, and at the end of the continuum, we have business school academics desperately trying to find proof of something that wasn't meant to be scientifically proven in the first place. And now, back to the man on the screen. In case you were already wondering, he wasn't included just to improve the aesthetics of this presentation. The man in the picture is Karl Mannheim, the father of generational theory, who every generational theorist is obliged to name drop to legitimize their foundation. I'll do the same. It was him who in 1928 formulated the theory of formative years defining the future of same age groups. But you know what the funny thing is? If you actually read Mannheim's work, not just cite someone who cites Mannheim, he explicitly advises against seeing generations as whole age groups, cohorts. To him, the word generation represented a much smaller group, a fraction of the cohort that makes itself visible through mobilizing around some new political agenda. Let's stop to think for a minute. What do the generational stereotypes in fact depict? They describe social phenomenon, forces of change in society, values of subgroups, usually some sort of elites that stand out from the rest. The hippie movement in the late 1960s was important, but not all youth back then took LSD and went to Woodstock. Thank God, someone might add. The hippie lifestyle was a generational movement that included only a fraction of the generation. The same applies to Generation Y. Sure, many want an international career and a lot of freedom at the workplace. But at the same time, we have countless millennials who just wish for a steady job to pay their mortgage and raise their kids, just like the boring generation of their parents. Millennial stereotypes don't reflect diverse reality, and the underlying theory is based on faulty assumptions. Is it then all bad to stereotype? Not necessarily. Stereotypes help us understand the complex world around us. That's why our brain is so good at making them. But it should be a one-way track. We can form useful archetypes of linked values to better understand the variation of lifestyles around us. But we shouldn't apply these summed-up stereotypes back to individuals, let alone whole age groups. This is a critical distinction we have to consciously make, because if we run on autopilot, our brain will surely save some energy and take the shortcut from the vegan nephew and his girlfriend to vegetarianism being super popular among all young people. In this talk, I presented you the case of why not to believe in generational stereotypes the way they are presented as pictures of whole age groups. The empirical evidence doesn't exist, and the theoretical ground is flimsy. At best, we can identify generational movements, but even then, we have to be careful not to overestimate their effect. I've used evidence from social sciences to debunk the millennial myth, but what I hope you take with you from this speech is critical thinking. Next time, when someone repeats a stereotype everyone knows to be true, ask yourself, is there something to counter it? To wrap things up, you probably wouldn't say most plumbers are alike, but in fact, due to socio-economic conditions, young and old plumbers together are probably a more homogeneous group than some 2 billion millennials on the planet. So why is it acceptable to say kids these days when plumbers of all age isn't? I hope you think of that. Thank you.